Coming up in this episode.
I mean, the leaky gut issue and the autoimmune issue has been an interesting hypothesis. And we all know, we're all fans of Joe Rogan. He just recently completed his 1 month Carnivore, World Carnivore Month challenge. And he talked about losing 12 pounds, feeling really, really strong, and actually resolving some autoimmune issues. He has some sort of skin condition,
right,
which is an autoimmune issue, and vertigo. So I think it's like white patches on his skin. And apparently he was claiming that that color was going back into his white patches.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Welcome to the H.V.M.N. podcast. What we do with our bodies today becomes the foundation of who we are tomorrow. This is Health via Modern Nutrition.
Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of the H.V.M.N. podcast. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Latt Mansor, and we just got back home from Long Beach, Los Angeles for the Metabolic Health Summit. And it was both of our first time.
Yeah.
Ton of fun.
You get people from everywhere. You get clinicians, you get scientists, you get patients, you get educators, all come together to really share knowledge and talk to one another as to what is important in the metabolic health world.
For those that might not have heard of the Metabolic Health Summit, it's a relatively recent conference that really brings the science of keto to the influencers, to the people. I think what's unique about this conference is that it's not just an academic research, very dry conference. It's not just some sort of trade show where there's people just shilling product all the time. It's really a nice combination of, as you mentioned, scientists, clinicians, product companies, influencers, and patients, and just keto enthusiasts. So a really interesting blend of people. So what I'd like to do for this podcast episode is to talk about some of the highlights for both of us personally.
Yep.
And maybe go into some of the best talks and explore some of the concepts explored there. For me, I think really the highlight was meeting so many of you guys out on the conference floor. I think Latt and I were just kind of joking that on the day that I came in, I couldn't move 5 meters without meeting a new person. Almost embarrassing, very flattering that people are spending their valuable time listening to us think about metabolism, ketosis, better human performance, better health. So that really gives us energy to, and Zil, credit to the guy behind the camera, to continue doing our best in terms of getting new guests, new content, and really share our ideas of how to live a well-lived life.
Yeah, it was a very humbling experience for me as well. To meeting these people really make me feel like what I'm doing with H.V.M.N. has a very strong impact in people's daily lives. I think from the agenda of the summit itself, I think it was organized quite well in the sense that it groups up all the talks according to the therapeutic areas. So let's say the first day they looked at neurological disorders, how ketogenic diet, ketone esters, or ketones in general in treating neurological disorder. And then they have a session on performance. They have a session on metabolic health in terms of metabolic disorders like insulin, diabetes, and all that. I think it was very well placed in that people know what to expect going in, meeting these big names and their research, sharing their research in these areas and really getting the best out of it. I think I like that format.
One of the things that I thought was also really fun about the conference was meeting a lot of the podcast guests in person. Sean Baker, Ben Greenfield, Amber O'Hearn. These are all online friends that I'd banter back and forth on Twitter on our podcast. And it's just cool to shake hands, hang out for a little bit in person. So if you guys have any suggestions of what conferences you guys like, maybe I'll put that onto my calendar for the upcoming year so we can all hang out in person. I'm going to have to quiz you on the talks because I'll be honest, I literally could only stop into talks for like 5-10 minute snippets because I was taking meetings and talking to people throughout the entire conference. So give a little bit of a snapshot cocoon of what happened this year at Metabolic Health Summit. Day one, I know that Dr. John Newman at the Buck Institute keynoted the first day.
Yep.
What were the highlights? What did he talk about? I just skimmed the titles and I have a sense of his research that it probably talked a little bit about not just the metabolic substrate value of ketones, but the signaling effect of ketones. Was that about right?
That's right. He talked about basics of ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate, how it's metabolized and how it's really important, not only as an energy substrate, but also as a signaling molecule, as you said. And then he moved more sort of closely into inflammation, how it's anti-inflammatory, as well as looking at different enantiomers of beta-hydroxybutyrate, so the L-BHB, which is hypothesized to play a bigger role in signaling pathways compared to DBHB.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit. So DBHB is the normal form that your liver produces endogenously. So when you are eating a ketogenic diet or fasting, when your body produces ketones, DBHB comes out. So when people talk about L-BHB potentially having an interesting signaling effect, like I'd unpack that or push back on that a little bit in the sense that, for example, drinking nail polish would have a crazy signaling effect. It's not necessarily meaning that it's necessarily good or bad.
Right.
And I think the subtlety here is with enantiomers, they're, again, the same exact molecular formula, but they're not mirror images of each other. Well, so the L form is not necessarily endogenously produced. So I think it's an interesting question. And I think it's really just an area of research, or if any benefit L-BHB has over DBHB, or
that's his research about, and I'm very curious to see what comes out of it. But he did sort of stress more around ketone bodies may be sort of relevant in signaling. One is histone deacetylation, which helps unwind the DNA around the histones so that they can be transcribed and then sort of cascade further on pathways.
Right.
The second thing that he mentioned is the direct binding of the beta-hydroxybutyrate onto the DNA itself, hydroxybutyrylation, and that itself has a direct effect. And whether or not L-BHB has a stronger effect compared to DBHB in this sort of areas, that is yet we'll find out with as more research gets
so
gets
HDAC
unpacked.
Inhibition is an interesting area because people that might have heard of HDAC inhibition probably associate with longevity genes. So that's an interesting area where we know that BHB is a HDAC inhibitor, which again could be interesting for unwinding or tightening the unwinding of different aspects of DNA that signal longevity proteins, for example. Our listeners out there probably have heard of methylation or acetylation, which is methyl or acetyl groups attached to the DNA.
Yep. He talked about it as well.
Right. And that's kind of interesting. Now you have like a beta-hydroxybutyrate attached to that same location on the DNA. And I think the question is, what does that mean?
Yep. He didn't really specifically mention any genes or any specific sequence that may kick off. I mean, it has been a few days now. But another one very important question I had at that point, I still remember quite clearly now, is that he said on a evolutionary basis, our DNAs are so long that it needs to be packed up in order to fit in the whole nucleus and our cells and all that. So it needs to constantly wind itself around histones and unwind in order to function well. Now, if you provide the body with constant concentration of ketones, does that mean you are constantly unwinding it? And what kind of side effect that may have on the body? Now, that was my question. It's the same thing as the anti-inflammatory properties of ketones. Is it a good thing to have a constant blunting effect on inflammation if you provide your body with a constant ketone body levels?
Yeah.
What if you are going to get a cold or if you're going to get an infection, your body is producing inflammatory response in order to fight that infection.
Yeah.
Now, if you have anti-inflammatory properties of ketone bodies, if you're on a ketogenic diet or if you're fasting, is that counterproductive? It's still a very early stage research here, and it's very situational.
Nick, wasn't there a piece of literature that showed that BHB also increased inflammatory response in a certain case?
I think it falls down to the concentration levels and the body's reaction to ketone body at that particular stage. What other interacting pathways are in play. I think they all are quite important to see whether or not like ketone bodies is good in that sense. Yeah.
Any other little snippets and tidbits from
I
Newman's
really
talk?
like the last day because obviously my research interest was in diabetes. So the last day they focus a lot on diabetes and insulin resistance, and how ketogenic diet has been used successfully to treat diabetic patients. And I'm really thrilled that actually can reverse diabetes or even reduce the amount of medication taken by diabetic patients. And they also mention, and this is a very important message for people outside of the community, is that doctors and medical professionals need to start looking at metabolic profiles specific to people on ketogenic diet. Meaning that if you go for a blood test, that normal range, quote unquote, need to be revised for a person on ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
Because of the different HDL, triglyceride, and LDL profiles in these people. It doesn't mean that they're unhealthy. It's just that they may not be normal. That is based on the
standard
ranges,
Western diet.
Exactly, referencing
the reference
Western
range.
diet.
Exactly. I mean, if you actually understand what the reference ranges are, they're just 25 to 75 percentile of general population.
Correct.
I think that's always been a funny factoid to me because the 25 to 75% of the average person is probably not even that healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just referencing something that's just like an arbitrary range here. And I think that's like, a lot of the discussion around if you're eating ketogenic diet, do you need more electrolytes? Do you need more sodium? Do you need more potassium? And I think this is just starting to be unpacked.
Yeah,
I think
it's revamping how we see macronutrients, micronutrients, daily nutrients intake and all that. And another interesting point that they sort of pointed out is that LDL on its own may no longer be a strong predictor of cardiovascular disease. In fact, they need to look at LDL, HDL, triglycerides, the pool itself, the ratio, everything into consideration, and as well as, weights as well.
Yeah.
So those are very interesting points.
I want to give credit to Dave Feldman, who I think has really been vocal about just pointing that out around. You really need to see that triad of high LDL, low HDL, and high triglycerides as a much stronger predictor for cardiovascular disease risk, where LDL alone, if you cut out the cohorts that have high LDL and low triglycerides, it no longer becomes predictor.
Yeah, exactly. And I had a really great long conversation with H.V.M.N, who works with Dave.
Yeah.
So we talked about type 2 diabetes, chronic inflammation, which comes first, insulin resistance or inflammation, which causes what, and how should you look at it? Should we demonize sugar now and glorify fats, or are we looking at something else? And she quoted, there are some studies on population that takes carbohydrates, but they're not getting diabetes. But as soon as they get on the Western diet, somehow the quality of carbohydrate causes diabetes.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Processed, refined, maybe. I haven't got the details for. She just mentioned when I think it was Okinawa. They often have carbs, they have sweet potatoes and all that, but now they have very high prevalence of diabetes because
the carb source has evolved.
Because of the Western diet being introduced.
Got it.
So
when I just think about diet these days, I think that processed foods solved a problem. They solved famine, right? Like a processed packaged food, very stable shelf life. You can ship it around the world. cheap. It feeds you. But I think now that famine has been solved for most parts of the world, we need to solve individual health, individual happiness. And I think that's where our food system needs to be upgraded once again. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of just chatting with Dr. Shawn Baker, who was on our podcast, really one of the seminal figures in the carnivore movement. Right. He was talking to me about that there's going to be proper clinical studies. Maybe not clinical studies. I don't think they're going to be obvious. You can't randomize and control a carnivore versus a vegan diet or something. You got to see what you're eating.
Right.
But they're going to I believe open study, just tracking biomarkers and seeing if health biomarkers improve over an intervention period, which would be a nice, I think, first piece of evidence to formally study carnivore in a more controlled setting, or at least like a measured setting. I mean, I am optimistic that we'll see good results there. I mean, I think it'll be very similar to what the folks at Verta Health, which is a company that uses a ketogenic diet to try to resolve diabetes. They implement a ketogenic diet and have a little bit of an app to help track the patients. They had really good results showing that they're able to reduce insulin load, reduce hemoglobin A1C, reduce fasted blood sugar. And I would expect to see if they're doing a similar open label study on carnivore diet, you'll see a very similar result. I'm pretty bullish on that. But yeah, I would be interested in autoimmune effects because there's this Hungarian health institute that puts people on super strict carnivore diets or fasting protocols, and it resolves a lot of leaky gut issues. And I think that was like one of the things that is this like weird term that keeps getting referenced in these like health gurus talking about leaky gut. And there's things like lectins and things found in plants that maybe trigger diffusion of your gut. So things leak, in and out, which causes GI issues and maybe some autoimmune issues.
Yep.
I mean, the leaky gut issue and the autoimmune issue has been an interesting hypothesis. And we all know, we're all fans of Joe Rogan. He just recently completed his 1 month World Carnivore Month challenge. And he talked about losing 12 pounds, feeling really, really strong, and actually resolving some autoimmune issues. He has some sort of skin condition, which is an autoimmune issue, and vertigo. So I think it's like white patches on his skin. And apparently he was claiming that color was going back into his white patches.
Wow, that's very interesting.
So, and I think, when we had a conversation with Michaela Peterson and Pete Jacobs, who is a world Ironman champ, they really seem to have resolved their autoimmune issues with the strict elimination of a carnivore diet. So there's clearly some signal here. I want to be cautiously optimistic that, let's do the proper science.
Yep.
But I believe these case studies, right? Like case studies can be published in formal literature, and I believe the testament of these individuals about what they are claiming.
Talking about case study, Mary Newport presented a very interesting case study. A case study that uses MCT and coconut oil in treating Alzheimer's. And they saw an improvement in 2 months. I think there was a question around like why use coconut oil if you want to be ketogenic. And we know that C8 is most ketogenic. Would you use C8 instead of coconut oil? In her sort of experience, she found that a mixture of both. So sort of 1 tablespoon of C8 and then 1 tablespoon of coconut oil have the best effect. It's the profile of the lipids and all that. And then she further on looked at using ketone ester from Vicha's group. Which is
our ketone ester.
That's a G. So she saw a massive improvement for Alzheimer's disease.
I think we had Dr. Mary Newport on the program as well, so you definitely covered that story.
And then another very interesting talk was by Chris Palmer. He's a psychiatrist, and he pointed out that if you look at a cohort of people with psychiatric disorders, like bipolar, depression, anxiety, and all that, it most often than not will correlate to metabolic diseases. Like if you look at them, they will have, tendency to develop diabetes, they have cardiovascular risks, they have hypertension and all that. And then if you look at people with cardiovascular risk or people with diabetes, they will have one, or more psychological disorders. Now that's very interesting. So he's trying to link, what's happening metabolically to what's happening in your mind, what's happening psychologically. I mean, he said, fair enough. If you have a heart attack, of course you'll be depressed. But ultimately, also, if you improve your metabolic health, would that improve your psychological well-being.
Yeah.
And he has treated his patients with ketogenic diet, and it shows vast improvement. But he also pointed out, and I was so excited about that because I had friends who have been battling with depression, anxiety, all their lives. So I was like, I'm ready to call them and say that, hey, you guys need to try ketogenic diet because it has shown to work. But Chris Palmer also pointed out the very important point is that if you have these psychological disorders and you want to try a ketogenic diet to try to resolve the issues, make sure you have, first of all, a psychiatrist or a doctor that you can consult with, and two, a dietitian or nutritionist who knows ketogenic diet well enough to put you on and monitor as you are on that diet. Because most often of the cases is that within the first month, the symptoms actually get worse because your body is trying to adapt to it. You're metabolically inflexible. You're trying to burn a different substrates that you've been not using for the entire, more than half of your life. So those advice, I think, is very, very relevant and very useful for people, and not just riding the hype train. Is like, right, I'm going on a ketogenic diet and I'm going to just jump off.
Yeah. And I want to just be skeptical and push back on a couple points.
Yeah.
Like, I think that if you're on a shitty diet, you're going to you're probably going to be depressed. So even if you clean up your diet with a ketogenic diet or a vegan diet or a fruit diet, and probably not a fruit diet, but a carnivore diet, you're probably just by cleaning up a standard Western diet, you'll probably feel better. And that's just getting a little bit more metabolically healthy. So I would say that some of the benefit is just cleaning up your diet. If you're just choosing like a paleo or Mediterranean diet, it's definitely better than like a really crappy processed standard Western diet. So that's probably some of the fact. And then I think the question is a ketogenic diet especially beneficial for some of these neurological conditions? And I think there stands the reason that the presence of ketones could be interesting because we do know there's an anxiolytic effect and some of the interesting applications of ketones themselves. So,
and also the calorie surplus as well. Some people, they don't realize, even though they are eating a lot of fat and they are decreasing the glucose, but somehow they end up eating more in a day that may itself on its own, cause diabetes or cause obesity. So that's something to look out for.
I think one of the interesting sidebar conversations I had with a couple clinicians, why there's an obsession with randomized controlled trials versus if you can just take a cohort of 100 people, put them on an intervention, they all get better. Isn't that signal enough that this is a valuable intervention for the population?
That's a very interesting question. I would say no, because it depends on your inclusion criteria. So a lot of these kind of studies, you would pick people who are already showing sign of deterioration. So meaning they are at their worst. Put them on a diet, just by statistics, majority of them will get better. Just by statistics, like normal distribution. So in that sense, it's a good proof of concept, but you need a randomized trial to really compare compare an intervention to a placebo to show that it's actually working.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I think we should ascribe to blinding and randomization. I think those are good experimental techniques. But I think like it just, I feel like it avoids the signal that we're observing from these n=1s, right? Like there's so many independent n=1s that it ends up looking like an interesting signal source. Am I claim that proves causation? No. All I'm saying is that I just feel like traditional scientists who dismiss the signal from carnivore seems overly arrogant or overly premature. I mean, it's just like, I don't think 10,000 people are just delusional and meat shills to just like say, hey, I feel awesome on a carnivore diet.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is with science, the funny thing about science is we try to control every other thing and we leave one thing out, which is the thing that we want to measure. And that's not the case with metabolism. Metabolism is the opposite, where everything is in sync, everything is working with one another. One goes up, the other goes down, or the other one go further up. It's so complicated that it's so hard to pinpoint. So I think that on its own, it's so hard to measure that we have to sort of have a standard way in which, in this case, would be randomized clinical trial to really at least be sure of one thing that everyone can agree upon. Because, if anecdotal, then you get people who are on carnivore, claiming everything's great. You get people who are on veganism, everything's great.
Claiming that's great, yeah.
So it's anecdotal versus anecdotal.
Yeah, fair enough. I shouldn't pick and choose. There's plenty of anecdotes from vegans saying that they feel the best ever.
And another thing, like myself, like I've tried the keto diet.
Yeah.
It felt great, but I felt like I wasn't as strong as I wasn't on keto diet when I'm in the gym.
Yeah.
So now, after listening to the talks and all that, I'm gonna try maybe cyclical keto diet.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll work better. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe that'll improve my body composition. But I think it's all trial and error. It's all like learning process.
It's personalized, right?
Personalized.
Your genetic baseline is different. Like this is what I say on every other podcast. Mm-hmm. Your genetic baseline is different from mine.
There's no one size fits all.
Your goal is different from mine, probably, and you need to have a personalized protocol to get there.
Yep.
And I think one of the main things I want to communicate through our podcast here is that one should understand the strategies, the mechanisms of action, so you can actually implement it for whatever your baseline goals are.
Yep.
Right. And I think that's really the meta framework.
Yep.
And I think that's where I think a lot of the gurus or the shills just go wrong, where it's like, oh, you need to eat like a freaking bar and a shake and like a ketone ester, and then you become God. And it's like, no, like understand why these tools exist and how to best use them.
That's right. I mean, it's like same like training in the gym, right? Some people have, high intensity training. Some people have a lot of cardio. Some people have very high resistance training. They go low weight, high rep, or high weight, low rep. It depends on what your goals are and how your body reacts to it. I had an interesting conversation with our friend, Dr. Brianna Stubbs, around the diet, and because I was telling her that after all this, these few days of amazing talks and meeting all these amazing scientists, and I truly believe that ketogenic diet has its place in especially in therapeutic areas. That is nowadays showing like how positive it is, and it's almost 100 years since ketogenic has been used for therapeutic users. But the message that is missing is that there will be cases that ketogenic diet does not solve.
Yeah.
So I was talking to Brianna about, what if, I'm just a normal guy who wants to go to the gym, want to build some muscle, build some strength, improve body composition, not necessarily lose weight. My biomarkers are normal. Should I be avoiding carbs? That sort of conversation. She's like, well, maybe not that much avoidance of carbs.
Yeah, I think the thing is, from my perspective, is that the carb recommendation is just too high.
Yeah.
And I think it's just like, that just needs to be moderated down to, look, what's the average carb consumption? Like 50% plus of American diet is carbs.
Yeah.
I think it's probably reasonable to say, hey, let's up your protein and healthy fat content, bring down the carbs a little bit. Mm-hmm. Because carbs are
it's just an energy source.
It's an energy source that triggers, insulin and some of these things that we don't really want for longevity.
Yeah. And you need insulin for muscle building.
Right. So you just need enough. So I think for me, practically, I basically cycle on and off between low carb and keto. And it's just like, I'm not allergic to carbohydrate. And especially, again, I think for me, and I think for most people, honestly, you don't have autoimmune issues. You're not going to eat a piece of broccoli or a bread. And I think people just need to realize that, it's probably okay to eat some bread, especially if you do some exercise. Yeah. Right. It's just energy balance.
Yeah. And the talks itself, they demonize insulin quite a bit. They're like, high insulin, and that's like, nowadays it's a bigger indicator of how bad your diabetes is versus high glucose, because sometimes your glucose will be normal, but your insulin is already so high that you might be in a pre-diabetic state already.
Yeah, and you can't tell.
And I agree with that. Like, chronic elevated insulin is bad. But when you need insulin, you need that insulin. Like when you're working out,
insulin, that's called type 1 diabetes. Right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So I think
it's a balance.
Every metabolite has its place.
Absolutely.
We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
I know one of my most popular guests, Professor Ben Bikman, also gave a talk. Yeah. What did he talk about?
So he talked about how insulin is a better indicator of diabetes more than glucose, even though glucose is much easier to measure.
Yeah, because glucose and hemoglobin A1C is the typical standard of care how to diagnose diabetes.
That's correct.
And his contention, which I'm hearing from you, is that
insulin
hyperinsulinemia.
Hyperinsulinemia.
Yeah.
Because sometimes even if your glucose is normal, your insulin may be very high, and chronic elevated amount of insulin may be a very strong indicator of you being pre-diabetic or going into diabetic or increased risk of diabetes. Diabetes is not just a glucose disease. It is a metabolic disease that has implications on different metabolites, hormonal response such as insulin, metabolites such as lipids. All those actually play a role in telling the whole story.
If the hyperinsulinemia is the proper root cause of diabetes, then it asks an interesting question. What is a typical treatment of diabetes? It's inject more insulin.
Correct. That is why during those talks, it's very interesting.
So therefore, that contention is essentially we are treating diabetes wrong. You're giving an alcoholic more alcohol. You're giving an insulinemiac more insulin. It might correct the problem acutely, but you're making it worse, right? You give an alcoholic a little bit more alcohol. It solves the problem acutely, but you're really killing the patient. And I mean, that's essentially the contention with the broader ketogenic diet movement, right?
Yeah.
And how we can change medical practice, especially with metabolic syndrome with diet as opposed to insulin. I've been to a lot of conferences, primarily based around Silicon Valley and tech, but I really appreciate this one because this is literally just such a dense way to meet all the different influencers, the guests that come on podcasts, both professors and social media personalities and YouTube stars. It
was very interesting to talk to different people who has either experienced it or treated people who have experienced ketogenic diet and how that impacted their lives and how what we're doing here in H.V.M.N. and really propagating the science behind it, the evidence around it, and to see that come into fruition. That to me is quite personally gratifying. Yeah.
Well, I expect you to give a talk next year. Organizers, Victoria, Dom, we're officially nominating Dr. Latt Mansor to give a talk. So hopefully you enjoyed this conversation and the recap of Metabolic Health Summit. As always, we appreciate your comments, feedbacks. Give us the thumbs up. Click the subscribe button. Hit the bell. Is there any other shout outs I need to give to grow our podcast? We really do appreciate any in each of those favors. Write us at podcast@H.V.M.N.com. I'm getting a lot of PR pitches for people to come on, literally getting spammed on that. Please, I don't know if I want to say this, but we're very much welcoming that spam because I just want to get the best quality people on this program. So the more people that are coming in, the more time and that Latt, Zil, and I can select really what I think is the best people to share their knowledge, share their expertise to our community here. So we'll leave it at that. Yeah. Thanks so much and see you guys next time.
Thank you.
If you're interested to learn more about H.V.M.N., visit www.hvmn.com/pod. Thank you for tuning in.